On a gloomy October evening in 1962, American spy James Carter arrived in Berlin. At the height of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall divided the city in two, creating a death line between East and West. Carter's mission was secret. He was to meet with an informant to obtain a document that would confirm the Soviet plan to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. In his gray uniform and false identity, he crossed from west to east. Under a street lamp in the shadow of the wall, he looked around as he waited for his informant. The cold air turned his breath to steam, every shadow a threat. Carter clutched the cryptic note he carried in his pocket. The informant was a German named Karl, working with the Soviets, but he had agreed to sell information for money. Carter was thinking about the briefing he had received from the CIA on his way to Berlin. On the brink of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. If the Soviet plan to place missiles in Cuba was confirmed, it could be an act of war. Carter's mission was to document this plan and deliver the documents to the West, but crossing into East Berlin was a risk in itself. Both sides of the wall were full of soldiers, and on the eastern side, KGB agents were watching every stranger. Carter double-checked his fake ID. His name was Hans Miller, a German merchant, but his accent was not perfect, and that could be a problem. Nevertheless, he had been chosen for this mission as the CIA's best agent in Berlin. Carter's background also suited the mission. He had worked as a field agent in the Korean War in the 1950s, gaining experience in gathering information behind enemy lines. But the espionage world of the Cold War was a different test, where the enemy was invisible and there could be a trap at every step. Before arriving in Berlin, he made preparations at a CIA safe house in West Berlin. There he was given a fake ID, a pistol, and a coded note. The note contained details of the meeting with the informant, but it was encrypted. Carter had used standard CIA methods to decipher the code, but part of the note seemed to be missing. He had deciphered the meeting place and the password, 6 hours and 9 o'clock at a street lamp in East Berlin. But there was another detail in the note, an address, a warehouse in East Berlin. Carter didn't yet know what the address meant, but he hoped the informant would give him more information. He remembered his last night at the safe house. The CIA's head of Berlin had told him how critical this mission was. If you failed, he said, the world could be on the brink of nuclear war. Carter could not forget those words. At exactly 9 o'clock, a man approached. It was Karl. In his hand was a newspaper with a sign for the password. Carter said the password in a calm voice. Karl nodded and led him down an alley. Karl whispered that the plan is hidden in a warehouse in East Berlin, but be careful, agents are everywhere. Carter took the note, but just then, a car headlight illuminated the alley. Karl panicked and ran away. Carter recognized the shadows inside the car as Soviet agents. He sprinted to the end of the street, but footsteps followed him. In the shadow of the Berlin Wall, first contact turned into a chase. Carter hid behind a garbage can and held his breath. Agents scoured the street but couldn't find him. Carter took refuge in an apartment building in the dark. He took the coded note out of his pocket and examined it by candlelight. There was an address on the note, a warehouse in East Berlin, but part of the note seemed to be missing. Carter realized he needed more information to decipher the note. He was chasing an informant through the cold streets of Berlin, but his mission was leading him into a dance of death. Carter had just started his mission, but he felt the cold breath of the Cold War on his neck. He had to travel to East Berlin to retrieve the document, and the journey would be his toughest test yet. James Carter took refuge in an apartment in East Berlin. In the shadow of the Berlin Wall, he met Karl, an informer, but a sudden raid by Soviet agents led to a chase. Karl had fled in panic and Carter had escaped the agents by hiding behind a garbage can. Now he stood panting on the narrow stairs of a dark apartment building. In his hand was the coded note Karl had given him, but part of it seemed to be missing. Carter examined the note once more in the candlelight. There was an address on the note, a warehouse in East Berlin, but the exact location of the address was unclear, and there must be another clue in the note. Carter knew he needed more information to decipher the note. The encrypted note was written in one of the CIA's standard encryption methods, but Karl had obviously written it in a hurry. Carter noticed a small symbol on the edge of the note, a star inside a triangle. He had seen this symbol before at the CIA safe house in Berlin. The symbol represented the mark of an informant, but why had Karl used it? Carter looked out of his apartment window onto the street. The shadows of Soviet agents still lingered on the street. The agents seemed to be looking for Carl, but he realized they were after Carter too. As a foreigner on the east side of Berlin, he was bound to attract attention. His fake ID had been issued as a German merchant named Hans Müller, but his accent was not perfect. It might not save him if he was stopped at a checkpoint. For a moment, Carter remembered his training at the CIA. To survive in the Cold War world of espionage, you had to calculate every detail. He thought back to the night he'd spent at the CIA safe house before coming to Berlin. There he had been given a keyword to decipher part of the encrypted note. The keyword was the night sky. Using that word, Carter examined the note once more. The second line of the note was a series of numbers 315, 14, 6. Using the word night sky as a cipher key, Carter translated the numbers into letters. The result was the word conf. Carter thought for a moment that conf could mean confirm. Part of the note had been decoded, but there were still missing pieces. Carter put the note in his pocket and decided to leave the apartment. The streets were still dangerous, but he had to move to find a warehouse in East Berlin. The address was listed in the note, but the exact location was unclear. Carter didn't know the streets of East Berlin like the back of his hand, but he thought he could get help from the CIA's network in Berlin. The CIA had an underground network in Berlin, and he needed to get in touch with someone who worked there. This person was a German named Anna, and she ran a pastry shop in East Berlin. The bakery was a cover. Anna was actually collecting information for the CIA. Carter hoped that if he could find Anna, he could decipher the missing pieces of the note. But walking the streets of East Berlin as a stranger was risky. Carter lifted the collar of his uniform and stepped into the street. The cold air hit his face, shadows moving in the light of the street lamps. Carter started to walk towards the bakery, but with every step he looked around. Then he noticed a checkpoint. Soviet soldiers were checking IDs. Carter turned down an alley to avoid the checkpoint, but then he noticed a shadow. A man was following him. Carter sped up, but so did the pursuer. Carter turned a corner and hid in the shadow of a door. The stalker approached and Carter saw the man's face. It was a Soviet agent, and he had found Carter. Carter drew his pistol but didn't want to shoot. The noise might attract more agents. In the tense streets of the Cold War, Carter was chasing his first lead, but it was leading him into a trap. James Carter hid in the shadow of a door in the cold streets of East Berlin. He was trying to reach a contact named Anna in the CIA's underground network to decipher the encrypted note, but he realized he was being followed by a Soviet agent. Carter drew his pistol but didn't want to shoot because the noise might attract more agents. The pursuer approached and Carter saw the man's face in the light of a street lamp. The agent's eyes were cold and determined, obviously KGB. Carter held his breath and waited for the agent to pass. The agent stopped for a moment and looked around but didn't notice Carter. The man walked to the end of the street and disappeared. Carter took a deep breath, but he didn't think the danger had passed. Every street and every corner in East Berlin was full of traps, and Carter knew it very well. Carter stepped out of the shadow of the door and continued walking towards Anna's pastry shop. The bakery was a small shop on a street near the center of East Berlin. Anna was German, and her pastry shop was a cover for her gathering information for the CIA. It was after midnight when Carter arrived at the bakery. The lights in the shop were dim, but Carter knocked 3 times on the door. It was a sign the CIA had identified. After a moment, the door swung open and Anna's silhouette appeared. Anna was a short woman in her 30s with a tired look on her face. She let Carter in and closed the door immediately. The inside of the bakery smelled of sugar and flour, but in the back room there were cryptic notes and maps on a table. Anna whispered, "You don't have much time here. Agents are everywhere." Carter put the coded note on the table and explained the situation to Anna. There was an address on the note, a warehouse in East Berlin, but the exact location was unclear. Anna examined the note and noticed the star symbol inside the triangle. "This symbol is Carl's sign. She said Carl was my informant too, but he was caught last night." Carter wasn't surprised by this news. Carl's panicked flight already indicated that something was wrong. Anna pulled out a map to decipher the missing part of the note. Warehouses in East Berlin were marked on the map. Anna pointed to a spot and said that this warehouse could be the one Carl had mentioned, but it was under KGB control. Carter looked at the map. The warehouse was in an industrial area north of the city. He would have to pass several checkpoints to get there. Anna produced another fake ID, this one belonging to a Soviet worker. Carter took it but noticed the worry in Anna's eyes. Anna whispered, "Be careful. If you get caught, you'll give me away too." Carter nodded and prepared to leave the bakery. But just as he opened the door, a car headlight illuminated the street. Carter immediately backed up and Anna turned off the lights. The car stopped in front of the bakery and two men got out. They were Soviet agents and they were searching the bakery. Carter and Anna hid in the back room. The agents started to force the door. Carter pulled his gun, but Anna signaled him to stop. She said we could escape through the back door. Carter and Anna went to the back door, but it was locked. The agents broke down the front door and went inside. Carter and Anna hid in a closet. Carter held his breath as the agents searched the bakery. One of the agents came into the back room and opened the closet door. Carter looked the agent in the eye and pointed his pistol. But at that moment, there was an explosion. A grenade had exploded in the front of the bakery. The agents were surprised and ran to the front. Carter and Anna took the opportunity to break down the back door and went out into the street. They didn't know who had set the explosion, but it gave them a chance to escape. Carter was trapped in East Berlin, and the shadow of Soviet agents was following him. James, Carter, and Anna had managed to escape from a bakery in East Berlin. Soviet agents had raided the bakery and were surprised by a grenade explosion. Carter and Anna took the opportunity to break through the back door and out onto the street, but they didn't know who had made the explosion. Carter turned to Anna and asked if this explosion was your doing. Anna shook her head no, but someone must have helped us. Carter looked around. The streets were dark and quiet, but there could be a new danger at any moment. Anna gave Carter the map and the fake ID and told him about a warehouse in the north of East Berlin. The KGB controlled the warehouse, and that was the address given in the coded note. Carter had to make a plan to get to the warehouse, but first he wanted to get Anna somewhere safe. Anna whispered, "Don't worry about me. Focus on your mission." Carter nodded, but he recognized the fear in Anna's eyes. Carter and Anna were walking down an alley when they noticed a shadow. A man was walking towards them. Carter drew his pistol, but Anna recognized him and stopped him. "This is Hans," said another CIA agent in East Berlin. Hans was a tall, thin man with a deep scar on his face. Hans whispered, "I set the explosion. The agents were watching the bakery. I had to save you." Carter thanked Hans, but he couldn't suppress his suspicion. Hans's timing was impeccable, and it bothered Carter. Hans proposed a plan to get to the warehouse, avoiding the checkpoints and reaching the industrial area. Carter agreed to the plan, but he didn't fully trust Hans. Together, the three of them made their way through the dark streets of East Berlin. Shadows moved in the light of the street lamps, and every step could be a trap. As they approached the industrial zone, they noticed a checkpoint. Soviet soldiers were checking IDs. Hans turned down a side street and pointed to a sewer hatch. He said, "We can go through here." Carter and Anna lifted the lid and went down into the sewer. It was damp and dark inside the sewer, and rats were running around. Carter led the way, followed by Hans and Anna. After a while, they reached an exit hatch. It was on a street near an industrial area. Carter opened the hatch and got out. But at that moment, a shot rang out. Carter immediately got down on the ground and looked around. Hans was pointing his pistol at Anna. Anna looked at Hans in surprise and asked him why. Hans said in a cold voice that he worked for the KGB. Carter took aim at Hans, but Hans was using Anna as a shield. Hans whispered, "I waited for you to find the document, Carter. Now it's over." Carter froze for a moment. Hans's betrayal had once again shown the brutal face of the Cold War. Carter had to find a way to save Anna, but Hans had his pistol to Anna's head. Carter slowly lowered his pistol and appeared to surrender to Hans. Only then did he notice movement in the shadow of a street lamp. A man was approaching, and it was not a Soviet agent. He was another CIA agent in Berlin, and he was following Hans. Carter took the opportunity to make a move towards Hans. Hans was surprised and let go of Anna. Carter tackled Hans to the ground and grabbed his pistol. Anna hugged Carter, trembling, but Hans laughed and whispered, "This is just the beginning, Carter. The KGB will find you." Carter tied Hans up and headed for the warehouse with the CIA agent. The cold face of betrayal shook Carter, but he had to complete his mission. James Carter was caught in the middle of a betrayal in the industrial zone of East Berlin. The CIA agent found out that Hans was working for the KGB and neutralized him. Hans took Anna hostage, but Carter took control of the situation thanks to another CIA agent. Hans lay tied up on the floor, and Carter rescued Anna. However, Hans's last words disturbed Carter, and he told him that this was just the beginning and that the KGB would find you. Carter didn't want to waste time interrogating Hans. He had to get to the warehouse mentioned in the coded note. The warehouse was in an industrial area in the north of East Berlin and was under the control of the KGB. Carter turned to Anna and asked her if she wanted to go with him or stay here. Anna said shakily, "I'm coming." Carter nodded and headed for the warehouse with the other CIA agent. The agent's name was Paul, and he was a veteran of the CIA network in Berlin. Paul whispered that the warehouse was 2 blocks away, but surrounded by soldiers. Carter, Paul, and Anna took every step carefully as they made their way through the dark streets of the industrial area. The light from the street lamps was weak, and the shadows were always threatening. As they approached the warehouse, they noticed a group of Soviet soldiers patrolling. Carter hid behind a garbage can and watched the soldiers' movements. The soldiers were checking a truck coming in and out of the warehouse. Carter devised a plan to distract the soldiers. He told Paul to throw a rock and distract the soldiers. Paul threw a stone across the street and it hit a tin can and made a noise. The soldiers immediately ran in that direction. Carter used this opportunity to sneak into the back of the warehouse with Anna and Paul. The warehouse was a large building and surrounded by a wire fence. Carter found an opening in the fence and went inside. It was dark and damp inside the warehouse. There were crates and boxes around. Carter took out a flashlight and shone it around. One of the crates had a Soviet coat of arms on it. Carter opened it and found a file inside. It contained plans for nuclear missiles to be sent to Cuba. But part of the file was encrypted, and Carter needed more time to decipher it. Just then, there was movement at the door of the warehouse. Soviet soldiers had returned and were searching the warehouse. Carter put the file in his briefcase and signaled Anna and Paul to leave. But just as they reached the back door, a soldier spotted them. The soldier shouted and opened fire. Carter immediately got down on the ground and fired at the soldiers. He hit one soldier, but the others went after them. Carter, Anna, and Paul walked out the back door of the warehouse and into the streets of the industrial zone. Soviet soldiers were in pursuit and bullets whizzed through the air. Carter turned down a side street, but it ended in a dead end. Their only option was to cross the Berlin Wall. The wall was right next to the industrial zone, but it was surrounded by barbed wire. Carter found a way through the barbed wire, but the soldiers were approaching. Paul threw a grenade and the explosion stopped the soldiers for a moment. Carter took Anna over the wall and followed Paul. But just as they jumped over the wall, a bullet hit Paul in the shoulder. Paul collapsed, but Carter didn't let him go. He picked Paul up on his back and ran towards West Berlin. They were beyond the Berlin Wall, but Carter had to decrypt the document and rescue Paul. In the dark alleys of the Cold War, escape became a matter of life and death. James Carter had made it over the Berlin Wall. The encrypted file he had seized from the warehouse in East Berlin was in his briefcase, but during the escape, Paul had been shot in the shoulder by a bullet. Carter carried Paul on his back, and together with Anna, they reached the dark streets of West Berlin. The Soviet soldiers had stopped firing after they crossed the wall, but Carter knew the danger was far from over. Paul's shoulder wound was bleeding, and he urgently needed a doctor. Carter had to get to the CIA safe house in West Berlin. Carter continued to carry Paul while Anna took the lead. Paul's face was pale, but he was still conscious. Paul whispered, "Let me go, Carter. Deliver the document. This mission is more important than me." Carter shook his head and said he would never leave a man behind. Anna turned down an alley and pointed the way to the safe house. The safe house was in the basement of an apartment building in the center of West Berlin. When Carter and Anna arrived at the safe house, he knocked 3 times. The door opened and Mark, the CIA's Berlin officer, let them in. Mark was a serious man in his 30s and Carter's direct superior on this mission. Mark looked at Paul's wound and immediately called for a doctor. Carter took the encrypted file out of his briefcase and handed it to Mark. Mark put the file on the table and began to study it. There were plans for nuclear missiles to be sent to Cuba, but some of them were encrypted. Carter had decrypted some of the code using the keyword night sky, but more information was needed to decrypt the entire file. Mark called in a cryptographer and started decrypting the file. Within a few hours, the cryptographer had decrypted the entire file. It contained details of the Soviet plan to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. It listed maps of the bases where the missiles would be placed, the dates of shipment, and the names of Soviet commanders. Mark studied the file and turned to Carter and said, "This document could change the world." But Carter was not at peace. Hans' betrayal and Paul's injury had shaken him to the core. He had also learned that Carl had been captured, putting the CIA's network in East Berlin at risk. Carter turned to Mark and asked him how to get this document to Washington. Mark explained a plan. "We'll take it to the American embassy in West Berlin, and from there it will be sent by courier to Washington." But Carter thought this plan was risky. The KGB agents in Berlin were still after him and would do anything to get their hands on the document. Carter said he wanted to deliver the document himself. Mark thought about it for a moment and agreed, but said that Paul's condition had to be sorted out first. The doctor dressed Paul's wound and said he was out of danger. Paul turned to Carter and said thank you. Carter put the document in his briefcase and prepared to go to the embassy with Mark. But just as they were about to leave the safe house, an explosion was heard. A car bomb had exploded in front of the safe house. Carter immediately lay on the ground and looked at Mark. Mark whispered that the KGB had found us. Carter drew his pistol and looked out the window. There were several men on the street, and they were approaching the safe house with guns in their hands. Carter told Anna and Mark to hide. The KGB agents started to force the door. Carter had to find a way out, but the safe house had turned into a trap. He had the proof of the nuclear plan, but he faced a final test to protect it. James Carter was in the middle of a trap at the CIA safe house in West Berlin. The encrypted file had been decrypted, revealing the Soviet plan to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, but KGB agents had found the safe house and attacked with a car bomb. Carter drew his pistol and told Anna and Mark to hide. Carter had to find a way out as KGB agents forced the door. There was a back exit in the basement of the safe house, but he knew it could be dangerous. Carter turned to Mark and asked if there was another exit. Mark nodded and said there was a tunnel hidden behind a closet in the basement. The tunnel led to a street in the center of West Berlin. Carter put the document in his briefcase and led Anna and Mark into the tunnel. Paul couldn't move because of the wound in his shoulder, but Carter didn't want to leave him. He put Paul on his back and entered the tunnel. The tunnel was narrow and damp with rats running around. Carter was in the lead, followed by Mark and Anna. At the end of the tunnel, there was a hatch. Carter opened it and went out into the street. But as soon as they stepped into the street, a group of KGB agents spotted them. The agents opened fire. Carter immediately got down on the ground and hid Paul behind a trash can. Mark pulled out a pistol and fired at the agents. Carter told Anna to protect Paul, and he and Mark fought the agents. One of the agents took aim at Carter, but Carter was faster and shot the agent. But at that moment, a bullet hit Mark in the chest. Mark collapsed and took his last breath. Carter froze for a moment, but he had to keep fighting. Anna was hiding behind a trash can to protect Paul. Carter neutralized the remaining agents, but he was running out of ammunition. Carter looked at Mark's lifeless body and anger grew inside him, but he had to deliver the document. The American embassy was in the center of West Berlin, and Carter had to cross a few more streets to get there. Carter put Paul on his back and ran with Anna towards the embassy. The pursuit by the KGB agents had stopped, but Carter knew the danger was far from over. When he arrived at the embassy, he knocked on the door and a guard let them in. Carter handed the document to the CIA officer at the embassy. The officer examined the document and said it would be sent to Washington. Carter had accomplished his mission, but at a great cost. Mark was dead, Paul was wounded, and the CIA network in East Berlin had collapsed. Carter retreated to a room in the embassy and sat in a chair. Anna was waiting by Paul's bedside. Paul was in a stable condition, but would need a long recovery. Carter thought about his experiences during the mission. Carl's capture, Hans's betrayal, Mark's death, and Paul's injury had once again shown the brutal face of the Cold War. Carter swore an oath that he would never leave anyone behind on a mission like this again. Anna nodded and said, "We will fight with you." By delivering the document, Carter had brought the world back from the brink of nuclear war, but the victory had cost him dearly. In the shadow of the Cold War, the price of truth was heavy, and Carter would carry it for the rest of his life.